Hi everyone, it's Jan again from the IXEG team, and it's time for another video flying the IXEG 737-300. I've been out for 2 weeks with a cold. Maybe it was corona, maybe not, who cares. And I'm wearing my mouth cover while I talk to you, so don't be worried about any contagion. And here we are in Kiel, which is the place I was born a good 50 years ago. And this is Kiel-Holtenau Airport, where I stood at the fence, barely able to walk, and gawked at the airplanes. And that's where my love with aviation and my career in it actually started. So I'm going to do a series of flights now, tracing my life through all over the world where I lived, where I flew, and I think that gives us some great opportunities to fly from some interesting airfields. And of course, it's going to take us all around the world because as a pilot flying the 747, I visited pretty much all of the continents except for Antarctica. So we're going to do some around the world flights with the 737 as well. And on every flight, I'm going to talk about an aspect of the airplane that deserves a little attention. I know many of you are, or most of you are adept at flying it in the normal operation, but the depth of the airplane is a little bit deeper than just the normal operation. And I'm going to start with pressurization today. Here we are sitting on the runway, and I'm first going to go over the way you would normally use the pressurization. And it's super straightforward. Here's the pressurization panel. You will set the proposed cruising altitude and of course the landing altitude, and there's the flight ground switch, and that's all there's to it. When you are ready to, or when you're taxiing out, you will flip the flight ground switch to ground, and of course you can see this gauge over here. No one really pays much attention to it. It shows the differential pressure on the outside. There's the yellow range, and this is the maximum differential pressure that the plane can deal with before the hull explodes. Well, it's not going to explode right here. There's a safety valve that opens. So that's avoiding putting too much pressure. You can imagine the hull of the airplane, the fuselage, is like a balloon that gets blown up. And of course, the air is provided by the air conditioning packs, which are fed by the bleed switches. So you would have to have the bleed on. Otherwise, if you turn off the bleeds, the pressure dies and you cannot inflate the balloon and keep pressure high enough for the humans inside. Of course, you can also use the APU to pressurize the airplane, and that's what you would do if you have a problem with the engines providing enough bleed pressure, or if you do a very performance critical takeoff, and then the APU can take over the job of pressurizing the airplane, and that makes the engines run a little stronger. Here's the cabin altitude on the inside. You see it starts at 0. It cannot go, well, it can go below 0, but the dial can go below 0. But the differential pressure cannot go below 0. There are big pressure relief valves that will open up as soon as that happens, because that's not structurally safe for the airplane. It would crumble like a balloon that you would suck the air out of. So that's not possible. But of course, the cabin altitude actually could go below 0. If you wanted to inflate the airplane on the ground, you could do that, but the dial doesn't go below 0, and it goes up, and you can see it goes up all the way to 50,000 feet. So if you depressurize the airplane while you're cruising, it will rapidly climb up to the ambient pressure. And down here is the cabin climb, the variometer, the rise or fall of the cabin altitude is depicted here. And of course, it's a little bit misleading because the pressure will, if the pressure rises, the cabin actually descends because the air is thicker on the ground. So more pressure means less altitude, and that can be a little confusing sometimes. So in normal operation, you will just flip this to flight as you are ready to take off, and then you flip it back to ground as you land. or after you landed, and that takes care of it. And you can see here's another gauge. It shows the position of the outflow valve on the ground. With the switch in ground, it's all the way open, and if you flip it to flight, you will see it close, and you can also see that the cabin actually descends a little bit as it gets pressurized a little bit. And let's do that. I'm going to flip it to flight, and you can see it starts moving, and here's the outflow valve, and you can see the outflow valve actually closes almost completely, and this will avoid air rushing into this hole during the takeoff rotation, and you would feel it on your ears as a pressure bump as a passenger, as the pilots. So that's why that is done. And here you can see the pressure relief valve that would avoid the airplane getting blown up too much. Now this is all that you need to do, so we're ready to go. Let's take off. I have everything set up, I hope, and here we go. This is a short runway, so I'm going to do a semi-static takeoff, holding the brakes, releasing them, and takeoff thrust. Set. I picked flaps 15 for this takeoff, and I'm at 48 tons, so pretty good weight. I didn't set my V2, but it's at about 130. Go, rotate. Here we go. And clearing the trees, no problem. Leaving Kiel behind, and this is the famous channel that connects the Baltic Sea with the North Sea on the other side, cutting the travel time around Denmark, and there are locks on each side of this channel, or this canal, and that was also a favorite pastime when we were young, to go to the locks and see all the big ships rising and falling to prepare for the journey across this canal. And let's start heading into the general direction of Frankfurt. When I was about 8 years old, we moved away from Kiel, and we moved to a little town called Gießen, which is just about 50 kilometers north of Frankfurt, and it has a small airport too, Lützellinden, where I spent quite some time as a young boy growing up, looking at the airplanes. But of course it's only about 700 meters runway, so it doesn't accommodate 737s, even if they're really light. So we're not going to land there. And I'm going to tune. I have the Warburg VOR set, so let's see when that picks up, and we're going to feed the FMS later on. Now back to the pressurization system. You can see that it works well at this point. The cabin is climbing with about 700 feet per minute, and you can see that the cabin altitude is already 2,500 feet, and the differential pressure rises fairly quick because the plane climbs a lot faster than 700 feet, so it's actually going up at a pretty good clip. Now let's do something here real quick. We'll level off for a second, go to vertical speed 0, and we'll demonstrate some of the other modes. Now the auto mode is, as I said, pretty much fire and forget. It can fail for a couple of reasons, but normally it won't. But there's also another mode called the standby mode, and if you switch to the standby mode, you can see the green light illuminates, and this is also a way, if the auto mode ever fails and you get the auto fail light, switch to standby and then back to re-engage it once you have corrected the problem. Now the standby mode is it's a semi-automatic mode. What you do is you have this section to control it. You can set the cabin altitude that the plane should target. You can see it's at 0 right now, so the plane is doing as we ask it. It's driving the outflow valve almost close, pushing, keeping more air in the plane, and that makes the cabin pressure rise and the cabin altitude descend, and it's trying to go back to 0 feet. And if you ever have to use the standby mode, you can you probably wonder, well, what should I set at the cabin altitude? Well, there's a pressure schedule down here, and this is the maximum pressure schedule. That's what we like to do for the passengers. We like to keep the pressure in the plane as high as possible, because that makes it easier for them to breathe. And you can see the flight altitude down here. So if you go to 29,000 feet, there's 28, there's 30, 28 is right in between. So it says 5.0, so that's 5,000 feet. So all you would need to do is you push the or turn the cabin altitude to 5,000, and you can see the plane is targeting 5,000 feet cabin altitude. And if that is going too slow, you can just increase the rate. You can see the rate goes up, or if you have someone with a cold, you want to have the rate really low, you can of course decrease it. But you must make sure when you are descending that you are not overtaking the cabin. Let's say the cabin is at 5,000 feet and you're at 20,000 feet. Now you're diving down like crazy, descending the cabin at a very shallow rate. And so at some point in time you're going to be lower than the cabin altitude. And then that's when the pressure relief, the negative pressure relief valve will open. And now the plane or the cabin altitude will descend just as fast as the plane is descending. And of course you're descending at 1,000, 2,000 feet per minute. That's going to be rough on the air. So that's the mode that we sometimes use as well when we actually use the auto mode, but we're descending very steeply and we can see that it's not descending fast enough. At that point in time we would just dial this down to the landing altitude, and then we would go increase the rate maybe to where the T is. We say T for 1,000, and you can see that's about 1,000 feet per minute. So this is just still about bearable for the ears, but it's making the cabin descend much faster than it normally would, so there's no risk in overtaking it. And the standby mode would also be a great mode. Let's say you just want to goof around and fly to, visually around the town and everything, and you don't really want to mess with setting up the auto flight altitude and landing altitude. So you would just put this on the landing altitude. For example, Frankfurt would be 360, and you actually want to always put it 200 feet below that, so it's slightly pressurized as you land, 160, and then you just forget about it. You don't have to reset the flight altitude, and you can cruise around and the plane will keep the cabin at 160 feet. That's very comfy. Now another mode, or that's the most basic mode, is the manual mode. This is the AC engine driving the outflow valve, and this is the DC engine driving the outflow valve. DC is what you have if you lose all electrical power except the batteries. Now you will control the outflow valve directly, open, close, with the switch. And you can see if I open it, the hole gets bigger, air rushes out, and the cabin actually climbs. This is a way to depressurize the aircraft. And if you close it, you can barely see this move. But it's tiny position changes of the outflow valve have a big effect, and DC engine is actually running a lot slower. If I go to AC and you see a toggle open, it's already going off the scale. So this is really tough to control it in the AC mode. You would go to DC if you ever have to do it manually, and then you can control the plane automatically. And if you do that, maybe you say, hey, I want to fly around like a Cessna, and then you just put it on AC, put it all the way to open, and now the plane depressurizes. Now look at this go. See, the differential pressure is going towards zero. Cabin altitude climbs like crazy. And of course, 10,000 feet, here comes the pressure warning. You get an intermittent warning horn. This is the same warning horn that the takeoff warning uses, and this is what confused those poor souls on the Helios flight. They were wondering why the takeoff warning is going off during flight when they were actually forgot to pressurize the airplane, and they all perished, of course. Now in our case, it's easy to recover the situation. We'll just take the outflow valve, we'll close it again, and this way, oops, opening, sorry, here we go, closing it. And now you see that the cabin starts descending. Need to close it some more. and this will eventually pressurize the cabin. The altitude will go below 10,000 feet, and the warning horn will stop sounding. Now, this is also a good way if you ever lose your instrumentation, you don't know how high you are, but you are fairly low, you can depressurize the airplane, and then you can use this altimeter basically as a substitute for your real altimeter. But of course, you have a standby altimeter, and that should work just fine. Now, another thing about the manual mode, you have to also consider the inflow or the input of air rushing into the plane. Let's say I'm turning off the bleed, you can see no more air is coming in, and as soon as I turn this off, you know, the plane is losing the air like a leaking balloon. You can see it's climbing again, and no air is getting into the plane. So I turn the bleed back on, and immediately the plane gets pressurized again and the cabin is descending. Now this is also getting affected by the engine thrust. Let's go back here. I'm going to turn off the auto throttle and grab the thrust levers. You can see I can move them now. Now let's look what happens if I reduce thrust. I go to power idle. You can see the pressure, you know, goes lower, and of course the plane cannot be pressurized so much because now not enough air is rushing into the cabin. Of course, it's still enough to get pressurized, but if I was on a single engine, or if my engines actually failed, the plane would also lose pressure. And if I increase thrust again, you can see pressure goes up, and the cabin is now pressurizing much better. Now this is pretty much all you have to know about the pressurization system. There are three modes: auto, standby, and manual. Manual is a full-time job if you really want to keep it comfortable. Normally what you would do is you somehow try to get to below 10,000 feet, and then you just open it all the way and then fly the plane not too steep in the descent to be easy on the ears, but that way you don't have to worry about jockeying the switch for every little power change that you do. And the standby mode is convenient. It's a fallback mode if you just want to cruise around and not worry so much. And of course the auto mode is what you would normally use. Another, or the last feature of the auto mode I'm going to talk about is the what we call the abort mode. If you never reach your flight altitude and start descending again, then eventually you will get an off-schedule descent warning together with the let's go over here. Together with the master caution, would get the air condition, and then this light here, the second from the left, will light up the off-schedule descent light, which means, hey, I noticed you're going back down, and we are descending, or I'm descending the cabin back to where you took off from. This is actually a nice feature if you have to abort the flight, if you have to go back to the field where you land, because you do not have to worry about resetting the landing altitude. This is something that you would do if you divert. Let's say you're planning to go to Frankfurt, it's at 360 feet, but instead you want to go to München, then you would have to set the landing altitude to 1500, which is the field elevation of München, and this is a step that you can omit if you're in trouble, if you just have to land again at the departure airport. And then in that case you would not do anything if the off-schedule descent light comes on, just cancel the warning. But if it comes on erroneously, maybe you never go to 29,000 feet, instead ATC keeps you at 24, and then you would get this light as you start the descent towards Frankfurt. In that case, you just dial this down until it's at the present altitude, and that way the flight altitude latch will trigger, and you get rid of the off-schedule descent light, and the pressure controller will now target the landing altitude as input here on the landing altitude window. Okay, let's wrap this up with a hopefully nice landing. The plane is turning already towards the airport. We're here over just east of Hanau, and you can see the airport in the distance. Autobahn 45 below, and there's the River Main, which is tracking west towards Frankfurt. You can see the Autobahn 66 to the right of it. And we're coming up on Offenbach, here on the left side of the river. There's the Autobahn 661 crossing the river, and just beyond that on the right side you can see downtown Frankfurt. Okay, gear down. And flaps 15. And time to take over manually. Aligning thrust levers, disengaging speed mode, and manual flight. Just a light wind out of the north.
400. 300.
Well, this concludes our first flight. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you soon for the next one.